What does it take to have a career that has spanned from newspapers and magazines to memoirs and novels, but with one common thread: food? Welcome to Everything Cookbooks, the podcast for writers, readers, and cooks. I'm Kate Leahy, and today I'm here with Molly Stevens. Hey, Molly.
Hey, Kate.
Do you remember the first time you read something written by Ruth Reichl?
That's a good question. I mean, I feel like she's just such a part of our whole world of food writing. But I remember when I first became aware of sort of how strong of a voice she had. I was living in New York when she was still at the LA Times. She was the critic and food editor at the LA Times. So I think I sort of had a little bit of awareness. But then in the early 90s, when she was the chief restaurant critic for the New York Times, I think she had just started, because she started there in like 93. So this is early on. She wrote a review of Le Cirque. And she wrote two reviews, one as a unknown diner, and then one as she showed up with her boss and was recognized right away. And it was groundbreaking. It was like she was not just talking about the food and the service, but she was talking about who gets that food and who gets that service. If you show up unknown, you get shuttled to the back. Those days they had a smoking section.
Oh, right.
And the New York Times ended up combining the two reviews together, and they took away a star. Like it was all, Le Cirque was always 4 stars. They took away a star. But I just remember it because it really shook things up. And then later, a few years later, she wrote an article for the New York Times Magazine that said why I disapprove of what I do as a restaurant critic. So she's this incredible restaurant critic and going to some of the finest places, but she was never lost sight of what it meant to, be reviewing elite restaurants.
And what it takes to afford a meal there.
Right.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And she writes about that in her memoir about her time spent as a restaurant critic for the New York Times, which was fascinating. That's where I first read her, was through her memoirs. I received Tender at the Bone, maybe as a Christmas gift, and read it cover to cover. Came out in the 90s, which is when I read it. It was the first time I think I read a book about somebody who was so interested in food throughout her life at an early age. And at that time, I felt sort of alone in the world. My friends were not talking about food. There was other things. Like pop culture did not include food in the 90s. I mean, I don't even think Food Network had even existed yet. It was PBS. So I read that book and it was like, oh, there's this whole world out there. And I think that's why I've always read her work ever since.
Yeah, I know. And you and I have talked about this. Like if you see Ruth Reichl has a new book or has written a new art, you sign right up. I mean, I'm getting that book.
Right.
It just, she just writes so well about food but writes about it in such a way that it's not just about the food.
Right.
I mean, the food is so vivid. And anyway, she's amazing. And I can't believe she's going to talk to us.
I did not bury the lead. Our guest today is Ruth Reichl. I don't think she needs much of an introduction, but she is a culinary icon, an author, and a recognized authority on food in America. She's held the highest positions of leadership in food publishing and criticism and broadcast journalism. And I believe she even has 6 James Beard Awards to show for all that she's done. We've talked a little bit about her memoirs, but she's also written 2 novels.
And some cookbooks.
She even had this great stretch tweeting for a while, which we'll get into. But her latest novel is called The Paris Novel. It just came out this spring, and we can't wait to talk with her a little bit more about the writing process. So let's bring her on. Hi, Ruth. Welcome to Everything Cookbooks.
It's a great pleasure to be here.
Well, we are thrilled to have you here, and we have so much we want to talk to you about. But first off, congratulations on your latest book, The Paris Novel.
Thank you. It's exciting. It's launching today, so I have no idea. Books, you write them and then they go out into the world and they have their own life and you have no idea what's going to happen to them. So
one thing I wanted to start with was in reading your author's note, you quote your late editor, Susan Campbell, and she said this line that really stuck with me. And anyone who picks up the book, please read the author's note because it's a really great author's note. And you talk about, what she said, that she loved that Paris chapter, which I think was from your last memoir, Save Me the Plums. And it's about you trying on a dress, and she was like, I want more. Can you please turn it into a novel? And that's such an interesting way to think about how you came to write this novel. I mean, when she said that, what was going through your mind? Were you already in the mode of thinking through writing another novel?
I was thinking about writing another novel because when I wrote Delicious, when I turned it in, they immediately signed me up to write 2 more novels. So I knew I had to write another novel, and I had an idea for a novel. But the minute Susan said that, I knew where to go with this. I mean, it was one of those just clarifying moments where sort of all the element, first of all, in the real story, I didn't buy the dress. And so it's like, well, what would have happened if I'd bought the dress? And then, I have a master's in art history, and I've always been really fascinated with the woman who posed for Manet's Olympia. I wanted to write my master's thesis on her because she was an artist in her own right and is utterly forgotten by history. And in that moment when Susan said it, I saw the old man who I met who had, in fact, his wife had owned that dress that I didn't buy. And I imagined him as someone who had known all these artists in the 1920s in Paris. And I saw him taking her to see Olympia. And I just suddenly hit me that I could put all of my passions for food and art and literature and fashion into the story of this dress. And so I'm deeply grateful to Susan for sending me down this path, and really sorry that she won't ever get to read the book.
Yeah.
Yeah, you talk about that and how she passed away before the book came out. So you had to switch editors. I mean, I don't know what point that happened.
Well, I had not sent a word in to Susan. I mean, she never saw one word of this book. And I was very fortunate because Susan had a young assistant. She sort of took over. And I was a little skeptical because she's young. I mean, she was the person who used to go get me lunch. On the other hand, Susan had great faith in her. And Cleo Seraphim stepped in and turned out to be a really fabulous editor. I mean, working with her was really a joy.
So, and Susan had edited Delicious, your first novel.
Susan had edited Delicious and Save Me the Plums and My Kitchen Year. And Cleo had, sort of read, I mean, she really knew my work because she'd been there for all of that. It's sort of exciting. I mean, editing is starting to be a lost art.
Yes.
There aren't very many people who are really great editors. And to watch a young person sort of come into her own in this field was very exciting because Cleo did a fantastic job, and her mind is very different than mine. So she was extremely helpful.
Oh, it's so interesting. We talk a lot about how an editor can really help our work grow stronger.
I am a big belief in editing and the need for it.
Yeah, it's so interesting to have this sort of the legacy. So I'm imagining you having Susan in your mind as you're writing because you'd worked with her for so many years on so many projects. And then I'm curious how editing, I mean, Kate and I know a lot about working with editors on cookbooks and food, but how it's different when you're writing fiction or nonfiction in the case of your memoir.
It's very different. I mean, having done cookbooks as well, and having worked a lot on the gourmet cookbooks, I worked with Rux Martin, who is a genius cookbook editor and extremely detail-oriented, which is what you need for you need a cookbook editor to be the nittiest of nitpickers. I mean, I remember with Rux, we had like a 2-day argument over whether it was called a stand mixer or not. We had another 2-day argument over farmers, where the accent on farmers
yes,
market
the possessive
goes.
for farmers
I think
market.
I switch it up
Yes.
because I can never remember which is the standard, because it's like, well, some people are really adamant that it's after the S or before the S or
Rux believes that it is after the S
aha.
because
Okay.
it is the market of many farmers.
Yeah.
I got to ask you, what was the verdict on the stand mixer?
She won.
Okay.
I have to say, I think Rux won every argument.
Right.
And working with fiction is a completely different. It's not, every editor needs to be very detail oriented because you have to, they will tell you, oh, you contradict yourself, in these 50 pages later, you said this and now you're saying this. But on top of that, a fiction editor needs to help you sort of shape the narrative. That is a very different kind of editing. And when it works really well, and I mean, I will never forget, Susan, I would go into Susan's office, and we would go over these pages, sort of sentence by sentence. And she would say, you need to do X here. And then I would go outside her office and sit down and write like crazy. I wanted for this book, I basically wrote the whole book and showed nothing to anyone until I was done.
Wow.
Which was a very different process. And so this feels truly mine in some way. Like, I feel like Delicious was a kind of a collaboration with Susan. This book feels like I've never had an experience that I had like in writing this book, which was, I am a writer who hates to write. I will do anything rather than write.
Here.
I love having written,
Absolutely.
which is why you keep writing.
It's so
But
true.
the writing is awful. I loved writing this book so much that I literally would say to my family, I'm going to my office now. I'm going to Paris. And I would feel like I was literally going to Paris. Writing this book was so much fun that when I sent it to my agent, and I sent it to my agent before I sent it to Cleo, and I said, I'm sure this book is just no good because it can't possibly be good because I really enjoyed the process way too much.
So many thoughts are coming in, but I'm back to the black dress, and it just makes me think how that unfolded this story for you. But both in the Paris novel and in Delicious, these are sort of, I think of them as fact-filled fiction. I mean, you fill them with so many real-life places and celebrities and things that actually happened, yet you've crafted this fiction around them. Kate and I were wondering, like, it sounds like Stella sort of came whole, and I'm hoping anyone listening, stop listening, go read the book, come back and listen, because it makes much more sense if you know who Stella is. But so I guess we're wondering, like, how do you find the real life things to put in there? What is that process like? Building the Paris that you go to every day in your office when you hit your office.
Well, I mean, there were certain things that I knew I wanted to put in. I mean, Stella is a person who is extremely repressed. I mean, she has never allowed herself to really enjoy anything in her life. It's how she's made herself feel safe, is to live this very small life. And, I am to my marrow a food person. I genuinely believe that food is a very good way to find your way through the world, to open yourself to the kind of simple pleasures that are available to anyone. And that if you do that, the world becomes a bigger place for you. So I knew that food was going to be a big part of this, and that part of how this character was going to discover herself was going to be through food.
From being somebody who doesn't really care about it at all or think about it, to one by one, she's kind of opening herself up to discovering these new flavors and experiences.
So I knew I was going to use meals that I had eaten. And so all of the meals in the book are literally meals I ate in France in the 80s. And I had notebooks. For me, I set it in 1983 and 84 for a reason. And one is that the franc was very low at that time and the dollar was very strong. So people with no money, me, could go to Paris on $1.50 a day if you were very frugal. But I actually got my first real job in 1984. I mean, I'd been freelance until then and living on a shoestring, living in a commune. And suddenly I have a job and an expense account. So I went from being someone who ate in very modest restaurants when I went to Paris, or, mostly bread and cheese in the park, to someone who was experiencing 3-star meals for the first time. So my notes were very much about the wonder of, I mean, at one point I said, I don't believe this food was made by human hands. And so I had the notes from that. And we all love the Paris of the 20s, the Paris of Hemingway and Fitzgerald and Gertrude Stein. So, I had this old man that I met. I got to imagine who he was. 83 meant that he could have been alive in the 20s and so I could bring that Paris. And so, he's a man who knew Picasso. And so I got to put a lot of my art history background into it, and then I have always been totally fascinated by the notion of, Shakespeare and Company, which is like a legendary bookstore in Paris. And the man who ran it, who started it, he's an incredible character. I can't believe that he doesn't walk through more books, because there are very few people like George Whitman go into this store and it's like, take what you need, pay what you can. And he genuinely believed that literature changes people. And I believe that too. And he allowed people to literally live in the bookstore.
The tumbleweed.
The
tumbleweed culture.
And you can still be a tumbleweed. You can still be a tumbleweed at Shakespeare and Company. If you go to their website, you can be a tumbleweed. I never was a tumbleweed, but I knew many people who were. I have always been fascinated by that. So I knew I wanted her to have that experience. So literature becomes another way that she's, opening herself to the world, and art becomes a way. So, I just, knew I wanted to put all these, and I knew John Ashbery, who I live up in the Hudson Valley, and John Ashbery lived in the town of Hudson, and he once invited me to come over and look at his kitchen, which was quite wonderful. And when I was there, he gave me a scrapbook that he had kept when he lived in Paris of recipes. And so I had this book to, look at and think about John being in Paris and, being enthralled with food. And then I had something really magical happen, which I don't think I want to telegraph for people who haven't read the book, but around Victorine, who was the model for Monet's Olympia. And when I started writing the book, none of her paintings existed, even though we know that she showed in the Salon 6 times. And so obviously, somehow, against all the odds, I mean, she managed to become an artist, although she was a working class woman from nothing, and a time when women had no rights and working class women had even fewer rights. And she was literally written off by all the male artists who said, she had been a prostitute and a drunk and a failure. While I was writing the book, one of her paintings was found, which is just amazing.
Absolutely.
That's amazing.
I mean, it was like, it really felt like, oh, this book was meant to be.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, especially following on, having Susan, having her sparked the idea and then not being able there to see the end of it. And now it's suddenly becoming historical fiction in as I'm thinking about it.
I wanted to ask just on a timeline thing, how long did it take you to write that first draft? And also, I know in the writing community, a lot of people talk about whether you're a plotter or whether you're a pantser. I don't believe that it's that binary. I think people are a lot of times a combination. Do you fall into a rhythm where you have certain places that you're writing toward? You don't know how you're going to get there. Or do you have like a really, really serious outline before you start?
I have no idea where I'm going when I start. And that's, for me, the fun of it is that I get to find out. I mean, these characters are playing out in my head and they're talking. And I, like, every day I'm wondering, what are they going to do today? Which is enormous fun. You know, it's like you're just sort of waiting for them to come to life and do whatever it is that they're going to do.
And then the discovery of that painting while you're in mid-process must have just
I
it's
literally
blowing my mind
Right, I
hearing
know.
you tell the story.
I mean, I'll tell you what happened. What happened was I started the book and I was about 2/3 done when COVID started. And I stopped writing the book during COVID. I produced a film during COVID about the broken food system and what COVID revealed about it. So for those 2.5 years, I did nothing but the film. I mean, I Zoomed with farmers and fishermen and chefs, policy people, like 6 to 8 hours a day during COVID.
It's a powerful film.
And then I went back to the book. I started again in 2021. I got vaccinated and we were able to leave home for the first time.
You could go to Paris. You could go back to Paris.
Yes. And I started working the first day and I was trying to find an address for Victorine and I Googled it and I found out that a painting had been found and I literally started screaming. It was just, what?
Wow.
That's crazy.
It was really crazy.
That's crazy.
Really crazy. And so exciting.
Absolutely.
Yeah, incredible. We do want to get into talking about some of your other writing as well, but in one of your memoirs, I think it was Comfort Me with Apple, you talk about working in restaurants and writing magazine articles as a sideline to what you call your real job, your more important job, which was as a novelist. And this is back before you were talking about getting your first job. It seems like becoming a novelist has always been a goal, and something you knew you'd be, but I'm just wondering what happened to those early novels.
I wrote one novel. It's terrible. And, you know, I grew up in publishing. My father was a book designer. And in the house that I grew up in, writing fiction was really kind of the highest calling. I mean, my dad would come home with books he loved, you know, in galley form, and we would read them. And he'd say, you have to read this. It's, you know, like the first Vonnegut book. I mean, I remember when he, you know, brought that home and said, you're going to love this book. So writing just was something I always wanted to do. And, you know, I wrote my first cookbook when I was 22. After that, people said, oh, she's a writer. So then I thought, okay, I should write a novel. The problem is I didn't really know what my novel should be. I haven't looked at it in about 40 years, but I remember it as being not very good. I mean, because my father was kind of a beloved character in New York publishing. I mean, when I moved to New York to go to the New York Times, I mean, all these people said, you know, your father was the nicest man in publishing. There was a great agent who was the agent for many of the food people, Robert Lesher. My dad had designed his letterhead stationery. And so Bob Lesher was the agent for this book, and he couldn't sell it.
So it was like the idea to be a writer was always sort of percolating in the background. But it was in those times, and you talk about this in your work, that to be a serious writer, you're writing novels. Food writing wasn't even a thing. There was like women's pages, and I think you say that also on your Substack. So to write about food and to do it in an interesting way, I mean, when did it occur to you that you could actually do that it could be a real thing and not just something you just do on the side because it's going to pay you?
Not just restaurants or recipes, yeah.
The first inkling I had that really this might be my life was, you know, I was a freelance writer. I was 35 years old, and the Los Angeles Times hired me to be their restaurant critic. And it was the first time that I thought, oh, maybe this really is my life. And so that was 1984, and it was such an exciting time in food. I mean, I think it's very different today for people who, I mean, especially for people who are writing about restaurants, because it's so adversarial. But in the 70s and 80s, those of us who loved food, there were a tiny handful of us, and we were all in it together. And it didn't matter if you were a chef or a writer or a farmer, whatever it was, we were all sort of saying, American food could be really good. And that was our mission. And so I was hired to be the restaurant critic at the LA Times. And I wrote for the culture section, not for the food section. But the LA Times had the largest food section in the country at that time. It was 60 pages every week. It was 2 big sections. And it had a big staff and a test kitchen and a photo studio dedicated. I became very interested in the notion of covering food in a new way. And I kept saying, and it was my predecessor was very traditional. It was very much a woman's section. When a new editor came to the paper, I went to him with a proposal for what the food section could be. And that it could be a way to cover the city that they hadn't thought about. And that we could introduce people in Los Angeles to the exciting city that they didn't really know about.
The diversity of food that was going on.
Yes. And also that it was about, agriculture and policy. And, I said, we should have someone in Washington covering agricultural policy, and we should have someone who's reporting on what's going on the farms. And it was a very grandiose proposal. He was intrigued. And when the editor, she retired, and he said, okay, you go do it. And I did it with Laurie Ochoa, who was married to Jonathan Gold. And the 3 of us reimagined what food writing could be. And we had everything from, we had comics in it. We had really good writers writing for us. We did profiles. We really thought about what could a food section look like. And it was so exciting. And the response of the community was great, because the supermarkets who thought they owned that section, it was the cash cow.
But their ad dollars.
Right.
Yeah.
Their ad dollars. It was like hugely lucrative. And they believed that they owned it. And they did not like what we were doing, because we were sending people to, go shop in Chinatown, go shop in, go down to the Vietnamese section in Westminster. Look around you. There are all these Latino markets. Go. And they weren't happy about it. To appease them, my bosses hired someone to do a focus group to talk about how they clipped their coupons and how they filed their coupons. Because those were still the days when you got the paper for the coupons, basically. And my boss came and said, you've got to come see this. It's really fascinating, because all these people wanted to talk about how much they loved this section and how they were learning about their neighbors and they were learning about new foods. The person who was leading it kept saying, but I really want to talk about how you file your coupons. And they were.
Wow. It's such a through line in your work, Ruth, is this, yes, food is the lens, but and you just said something, you just said about to look around. And I just feel like that's something that you continually bring to your work, is this intense observation, this acute awareness of how, yes, food is the lens, but you're seeing the whole world through it. Economic, political, cultural, artistic, all of it.
Yeah. No, I really believe that. I think there's nothing you can't cover through food, nothing you can't learn through food. And, I feel like cooking is the natural human activity. It is like the one big thing that separates us from animals. We cook, they don't, and the more we find out, they communicate with each, we're increasingly finding out, that all the things we think animals can't do, they do, but they don't cook. And we transformed ourselves as a species through cooking. And it's how we made our big brains. And, sort of everything comes back to cooking.
I remember being in college and studying sort of foodways for my history thesis. And everything I was reading at that time was just like, but food is a weak source of cultural understanding. It was very much a time where food was not seen as important, at least in academic ways. And so I'm trying to write about, I think food is really important. And it was sort of like, and now it's almost like food is at the center of everything, and it's kind of mind-boggling how far it's moved. I mean, do you sometimes feel like, okay, have we gone too far?
I don't. I mean, I just feel like we didn't talk enough about food for most of American history, and it's really too bad. And it's how we've gotten to this place where we are, that, we have this crisis of obesity, and 6 out of 10 Americans have food-related illnesses. And that's because we weren't paying attention. And it's a tragedy that we weren't. And, that's kind of what my film is about.
Hi, I hope you're enjoying this episode of Everything Cookbooks, but it does take resources to make it happen. So I'd like to invite you to help us keep the lights on. For ways to support the show, go to everythingcookbooks.com/support. There, you'll find links to any upcoming insider events where we go even further behind the scenes of the cookbook publishing world. You can also leave us a review, order books through our affiliate page, check out our t-shirts, sweatshirts, or other merch, or just buy us a round of coffee. Every little bit of support really helps keep the show going. And thanks for listening.
Whether you're writing nonfiction, memoir, fiction, novels, your voice is very identifiable in you. And can you tell me just a little, how have you been able to jump from different genres? And how has that sort of shaped the way you write?
I wish I could answer that. I can't. So I was at the New York Times, and I'd been there for about a year, and editors started calling me up and saying, you must be writing a book. And I wasn't writing a book.
Huh.
After the 6th or 7th editor had called me, I came home and said to my husband, I must be writing a book. I don't even know what I should write about. He said, well, you're always telling these stories about the people who taught you to cook. I knew these wonderful characters I have throughout my life who've been very instrumental in turning me into the cook that I became. So Tender at the Bone started out as a series of basically short stories about these various characters. I mean, Alice, who was my Aunt Bertie's housekeeper, and Mrs. Peavy, who was this amazing person who worked for my parents for a while. And when I turned it in to my editor, that this was not Susan Campbell, this was my previous editor, Ann Godoff, she said, each of these stories is wonderful, but you need to figure out a way to tie them together, which was, oh, yeah, I'm a journalist. I've only ever written short. Now I have to figure out how to write long.
Right.
So I went back and I thought, how do I make this a book rather than a series of short stories? And I realized that I was the through line. So I went back, and I hadn't intended it as a memoir, but I went back, and it was pretty easy to do then. It was just, it's not about these people. It's about the training of a food person.
The short stories, you were, I'm going to say absent, but you were the observer, not a character in a way.
Yes, exactly. And in journalism, you don't put yourself into it too much, right? And so suddenly, this is interesting. I get to talk about myself. Doing that, you face all kinds of interesting issues, like, what do you have a right to? What's your story? What's someone else's story? Whose permission do you have to ask? And of course, there was a whole issue of my mother and her mental illness, which, had she been alive, I never would have put any of that in, but she wasn't anymore. And then, with later books, it comes into, what can I say about my son, for instance? I mean, I believe you can say anything you want about your parents, but you can't about your children.
How do you navigate that? I mean, because there's 6 memoir, you could call them. I mean, depending on how you identify. How do you navigate what stories you can tell?
Well, I really dealt with it with my first book when I realized that there were a few stories which I felt I really needed to ask permission. I mean, one was Marion Cunningham, the writer of some of my favorite cookbooks, one of my favorite people on the planet, someone at a certain point in my life, I talked to her like every day. I still miss her every day of my life. But, she had been a terrible alcoholic. And I put that in the book. And then I thought, I can't do that without sending her the chapter. So I sent her that chapter and said, is there anything you want me to take out? And she said, no, I'm fine with it.
Wow.
And my college roommate, again, I'm very much telling her story, and it's a story that has to do with race, so it's sensitive. And I sent it to her, and she asked me to change her name, which I did, but otherwise was fine with it. So it's like, I feel like if you're wondering if it's yours to tell or not, then you need to ask that person if you can use the material.
And I'm imagining that's I don't want to say scary, but
right.
I would say it takes courage to do that, but you need to do it.
Yeah. The one that I was most nervous about was the person I call Serafina in the book. And I sent her the chapter, and I didn't hear from her and didn't hear from her and didn't hear from her. And finally, my husband said, will you just call her? And I called her, and she said, oh, I love your book. Oh. And I said, and she said, and I want you to change my name.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Well, and I do think there's something to that. Just more cookbooks now are coming out with more of a memoir aspect. And a lot of these authors might be first-time authors and not quite thinking through what is mine to say if it happened. So I think this idea of if you're not sure, if there's something sensitive, reach out to that person, ask for permission. Then you can maintain that relationship with this important person in your life without that sort of hanging over their heads. That's really kind of sound advice.
And I have to say, I mean, the other piece of it is for Tender at the Bone, and my then editor said to me when I handed in the first final draft, she said, there's a secret buried in this book. And I said, ooh. And she said, there's something you're not saying about your mother. And I had tried to make my mother this like halcyon anti-Mame character. I said, well, she was mentally ill. I mean, she was really severely bipolar. And she said, well, you either have to deal with it or leave her out because this isn't working. As a reader, I know you're not saying something. Mom wasn't there to ask anymore. And I took a deep breath and decided I would just say she was bipolar. And I was really glad that I did because I got so much mail and continue to get it. I mean, that book has been, it first came out in 1998 and it has never been out of print. I get letters all the time from young people who have bipolar parents saying, this book was so important to me because I know that I can be okay. It's very hard to have a bipolar parent.
Yeah, I thank you for sharing that. I just thinking about how we write in our, in our silos, we write in our quiet places, we write alone, and we don't always imagine the impact of our work when it's read by others. And the level of honesty that's demanded by the genre of a memoir is something that you really have to dig deep for, and that relationship with that editor to pick up on that was something missing.
And I can't picture the book without your mother in it.
Right.
No, and she's a great character. I mean, as a writer, I'm blessed to have had this vibrant, crazy person who was tortured and wonderful. And, and then I ultimately ended up writing a book ended up writing my mother's book, the book she would have wanted to write.
Right. I noticed on your Instagram, it says writer, cook, eater, or writer, eater, but writers first. And,
right.
And so a lot of our listeners are writers. And so we just ask you some of the nitty gritty, like what is your process? Do you carry notebooks around? How do you reference like on your Substack, there's vintage menus that show up. I'm just like, how do you have access to all of these memories and references?
Well, for one thing, I am a pack rat. I throw nothing out. And it's not that I thought this stuff is so important. I mean, I've saved every letter I've ever got, letters I got at camp. I mean, I am a saver. So, those menus, I mean, years, when you were a restaurant critic in the pre-internet days, you stole menus because you needed them. So I've got them all, boxes and boxes and boxes of them. My archive of, I've been writing about food for 55 years. And I've got every scrap of, tape that I ever took. And as a writer, when I went to Gourmet, I knew I would get fired at some point. I didn't think they'd close the magazine, but I knew that this was not my forever life. It was too good, but that I would want to have access to what had happened. And so every day, at the end of the day, I printed out like 5 or 6 emails I had gotten that day and just saved them so I would have a record, because I didn't have time to keep diaries at that point. I mean, most of my life I've kept diaries, but at a certain point I just didn't have time to do that anymore. So, I have this great, you go in there and it's like you're right back in that moment when you see these random emails from people about what's going on. It could be from my publisher, from a reader, from an author, from my babysitter, just moments of the day, and there they are. And I would recommend, if you think that you're going to want to write about this time, it's an amazing thing to do, is just to have this archive of.
Right.
Find a way to chronicle it.
Because I think a lot of us think, oh, I'll remember that. But you don't remember it, or you might remember it or misremember it, or you almost remember it, but you wish you had saved that one piece that kind of puts it all kind of clearly in your memory. Yeah.
And if you're a writer and you want to recreate it, whether it's in fiction or nonfiction, or having those details,
Absolutely.
that level of detail, like, yeah, you remember that happened, but you don't remember what color sweater your assistant was wearing that day. That would bring a vivid, I just, when I think of your writing, and Kate said earlier how your writing is so recognizable, but there is there's a vivid quality to it that makes it all come real.
And just thinking back to the Paris novel too, just take us back to some of those restaurant scenes, because I'm wondering if you're looking at your old notebooks from traveling in Paris in the 1980s, and then you're at the Trois Gros. I'm sorry, my French pronunciation is terrible.
So Trois Gros, there is a chapter in, I think it's in Tender at the Bone, where Kermit Lynch, the wine importer, in the 70s, when I was first starting out, Kermit was not then a big famous wine importer. He was a guy who had a storefront on San Pablo Avenue in Berkeley. And he just had cases with, a bottle of wine, and his wines were like $2 a bottle. Wow. And I got to know him because I would go hang out there. And one day I said to him, I'd love to do a story about your process. Next time you go on a buying trip, can I come with you? And so I went with him on a wine buying trip in 1978. And we did go to Trois Gros. And we ate in the kitchen in Trois Gros. And that is the meal that we had. And I have very good notes from that meal. That story never appeared in the magazine. So there it was, that meal. The meal at Marc Meneau's restaurant, L'Espérance. I did actually, with a friend in the 80s, when I was at the LA Times, went to Meneau. He had been there before. I had not. And we did walk down from the church on the hill. We walked down to the restaurant, this beautiful walk, and went to the restaurant. And we did go there for lunch and stay through dinner. And again, I have copious notes on, he literally gave us everything on the menu. I mean,
you needed to walk afterwards.
Yeah. Then it was too dark.
Right.
We literally got there at 1 o'clock and left at 10.
Wow.
Crazy.
But it comes across in the novel. I'm sitting there. I've gone to the church. I'm in this really special restaurant. The chef is coming over and talking, to Stella in the book. But you can kind of tell, you can't just come up with that. I mean, you can, but just having it based also in your own personal lived experience, I think makes a huge difference.
And then I did not know about his history. So that's where you do research. And it does turn out that he did call it L'Espérance because he became a chef in the hope that his wife would marry him. And so it's the hope.
Very sweet.
And, it's a lovely story, and just, something that when I decided to use that meal.
So that research, you decide to use that meal, going back and finding your notebooks from when you were there, and then it's not quite like that research is happening as you're writing because there's something missing from the scene.
Yeah. I just want to know more about, he becomes a real character, and I admired him enormously. And, I did have this experience. It was very personal. And then I thought, how did he become a chef and what happened? And, and Jules, who was a completely invented character, but, he talks about his father and his father being a snob and how, he would not have approved of this restaurant. That's all totally made up. But
that's the fun part of writing fiction.
Right. And I love this sort of how you feed your imagination, like you're feeding it with fact and creating this. Listening to you talk about taking notes and keeping diaries or printing out emails, I have to just ask you or say something a little bit about those 10 years of your tweets, Ruth. You on Twitter was just a wonderful, for those of us, that they were these little moments of haiku-like snapshots. They were very meditative, little moments of Zen, I would say.
Right.
I loved doing those. It was another discipline. When somebody introduced me to Twitter, that discipline of those few characters. It was like, how much can you say? Can you create a moment in 140 characters? How terse can you be and give people a snapshot of your day? And it was just something I got to do every day. And I could not have been more surprised when they suddenly had this following. I just thought it was something I was doing for my friends. It was shocking when suddenly, well, of course, the Ruth Bourdain thing didn't hurt. But, I was sorry when I stopped it, but it was like, I felt like I had done it and it was starting to be a parody of itself. And it just seemed like it was time to put an end to it.
Well, and you moved over to Substack. And the tweets themselves, some live in My Kitchen Year.
Yeah.
I was happy to see them show up there.
Yeah. I was really happy to put them in there. And that book started with the title, The Tao of Ruth, because Tony Bourdain did this radio show where he made fun of my tweets. Mm-hmm. And then he said, who is this woman? Which was ridiculous because I knew him well. But
one big takeaway for our listeners is just to be a creative person. Never just sort of think you can only do one thing. It's to always try to push and experiment. And it seems that throughout your evolving career, you've done so many different things, all within the world of words and food and so much more. But I wondered, as we're wrapping up, if there's any sort of words of wisdom you would say for people who are in creative fields now, who are passionate about writing and food. What are ways to sort of sustain, a creative life?
I would say the biggest piece of advice I have for anyone is to keep doing things you don't know how to do. It's how you stay young. It's so easy to keep doing the familiar things. And at the point I think I decided to stop being a restaurant critic was when I realized I could do it in my sleep, that it was time for me to move on. And, so when I took the job at Gourmet, I had no idea how to be an editor, how to manage people. I just didn't know. I thought this is going to be really scary and I'm probably going to fail, but I'd be a fool not to try. I think it's important to keep doing new things and not to get stuck in the familiar. And the other piece of advice I have, and it's something that I've learned over and over and over in my career, is if it scares you, it's probably important. The things that keep you up at night are the things that are worth doing.
Great words to end with. We do have to ask one last question. Any more novels in the works?
Yes.
Ooh.
I loved writing this book so much that I'm working on a sequel. I just didn't want to give them up.
Oh, same characters?
Same characters,
okay.
Yeah. I just want to know what happens to Stella now.
Wonderful. Well, we will stay tuned for that. Ruth, this has been such a delightful conversation. Thanks for spending the time and coming on our podcast.
Well, thank you for inviting me. I have loved every minute.
Thank you for listening to Everything Cookbooks. For more episodes and ways to contact us, go to our website, everythingcookbooks.com. You can find the show on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your audio. And if you like what you hear, please leave us a review. It really helps. Any book mentioned on the show can be found on our affiliate page at bookshop.org. Thanks, as always, to our editor, Abby Cerquitella. And until next time, keep on writing, reading, and cooking.